This is Burn This Book, a podcast where we, Nicole and Eden, read a banned or challenged book twice a month and discuss its meaning, impact, and censorship to make it more accessible for all readers. And today we will be chatting with Sabrina Baeta from Pen America. You'll notice that Nicole is not here. She had to address some things off mic. So it'll just be me and Sabrina. Sabrina, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Really happy to be here and having this discussion with you today. So I'm Sabrina. I'm a senior program manager on the Freedom to Read team at Pen America, where we look at Pen America is a free expression literary organization that does a whole bunch of programming. You may know us from different literary awards. You may know us from our, great socials out there talking about the book banning crisis. My team specifically looks at educational censorship at the K through 12 public school level. And over the last 3-4 years, that's really looked like book banning.
Yeah, could you dive more into that? That's
Yeah.
a really specific lens through the educator lens.
Yeah, and really, so it was started as kind of a two-person operation. It was myself and Dr. Tasselin Magnuson. If you're somebody who's been following the research of this, and you've definitely heard that name before, we're
We've
hired
actually
as
had her on before.
Oh, wonderful. I'm not
Yes.
surprised at all. She was I'm lucky to call her both a wonderful colleague, but also a friend. And we started this really with the idea that authors were coming to Pen America and saying, hey, my books seem to be getting removed, some kind of ban, if we can even say that word in this country back in 2020. Um, and we don't really know what's happening. So Pen America was like, okay, we're going to look into this. And I always like to say I started on a 3-month contract. It was supposed to just be this, little index seeing like, oh, is this a problem? Is this happening? And that was over 3 years ago now. And unfortunately, I have way too much job security because the book banning crisis has only increased almost tenfold at this point. To the point where I think the first year was 2,500 bands that we categorized. Then it was 3,600. And then last year alone was over 10,000. And we're looking at these specific instances of book bannings to help give people an understanding of the content that's being banned, the books that are being banned, the authors that are being silenced. But it's also way more pervasive with different types of silent and soft censorship going on.
Yeah, that's a massive increase year over year. 10,000 bands. Who are making these bands?
Yeah, that's one of the big questions that we were asking ourselves. And really, this movement began with, we call them kind of grassroots advocacy um, groups, but they're nationally coordinated. So they're not really grassroots. And when I say advocacy, I mean they're advocating for books to be removed. So maybe not, the positive connotation of advocacy that people who are listening might associate with these, with this. And these are Citizens Defending Freedom, Moms for Liberty. You've probably heard of some of these names by now. But they really had coordinated action of removing these books, doing large stunts and displays, and misrepresenting essentially the books in order to facilitate their removal. And then this went up to the state level, and we started seeing state legislation that was influencing book bans. Some of them topics related, some of them were process related, in a way that started creating, if you think about it, a group at the group level is going to cause a lot of damage, but it's going to be district by district. Once you start having state legislation or legislators play a part, it's every district in that state gets impacted. And that's really, where a large explosion of the book ban, still instigated by those groups, but now, kind of having blanket coverings to the point where we have some states that have, like Tennessee, South Carolina, Utah, have, book lists of books that they no longer allow within their schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm based in Utah and I'm aware of our book list here.
Yeah.
And yeah, I remember writing my legislator and saying, hey, the people in, I can't even name our counties, sorry. But people in San Pete County what they deem as inappropriate or not relevant to their students will be vastly different than Salt Lake County. Just like very different demographics between those two alone and everyone in between. And so it is not fair to have one person in that district be part. Yeah, just basically if it's coordinated, they can do a lot of damage.
Absolutely. And this is really has been caused by a very vocal minority. Most, survey after survey shows that most Americans don't want these books banned. And I think most people understand that a school library, a public library, it's not that every material is going to be something you agree with. Actually, if a library is doing what it's supposed to be doing, there's probably going to be some materials you agree with, some things you've never heard of, and some things that you completely disagree with. But the availability of those materials, the right students have to be able to engage with different viewpoints, ones that reflect their community, ones that are different than their community, and be able to critically think about those things. That's what's important. And a lot of times we have things in libraries where the point is to kind of point to it and say, this is not great. But we need to have the documentation for that. So even if you're removing things based on like, okay, you don't like this material, that's not a good enough reason. And
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the point of the material. And what you pointed to, what I, would say is, oh, I agree with, or viewpoints I agree with, it's going to be completely different than someone else, but we all have to respect each other's rights to have those viewpoints and have the availability of materials with differing viewpoints.
Definitely. Yeah, I find it really interesting that there's a lot of effort to remove books when these same parents probably are giving their kids smartphones and unlimited access to the internet. Uh, and I feel like that energy could have a better impact, like the impact that they're looking for if there were the same organized effort to like protecting kids on the internet versus like pulling books of nuanced stories under the supervision of teachers and librarians that kids can have those conversations,
Yeah.
who kids can have conversations with.
Yeah.
And so,
I
does it
completely
feel
agree
like?
with you. And that, that librarians and teachers are the experts,
Mm-hmm.
who are in books. They've had to be, they were written, oftentimes illustrated. They went through a publishing process. There's a huge vetting process that doesn't exist in every other avenue that a student is going through to find information. And then
Yeah.
they still have a parent, has someone that they can turn to and ask questions of. But then they also have teachers and librarians for, not realistically, not every student is going to be able to get that support from their parents. So it's important that they have that in some kind of system. And what's also really important is it's this idea of shielding students from certain topics. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
life is filled with those topics. You can't turn 18 and suddenly get overwhelmed with every hard, like good and bad. That's the thing, is there's
Yeah.
good content and bad content that's being banned, but good experiences of life, even if they're adult experiences. Like a book is such a soft introduction to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's self-paced. Oftentimes these are just in school libraries, so the student is going and selecting the book for themselves. They can also skip parts that they're not comfortable with. It's a medium that honestly offers the softest introduction to topics. So it's where we would want our students turning to, explore these things. Certainly not each other, not the internet, where there's less, vetting happening, and where they
Mm-hmm.
don't have that structure where they can turn to adults and have those conversations. But I also think it's a student's right to understand the world they're going to be entering, or they're already a part of. And that's the other thing, is it's the idea that somehow by not having these books available in a school, they will never come across these topics. One of the biggest topics that's banned is death and grief.
Mm-hmm.
And like that is not something that waits for anyone to turn 18 to suddenly be introduced. There are students who are experiencing that from an early age, and they need materials that deal with those topics to be able to help process what they're feeling, process what their community is going through, what their, even what their families may be going through. So that can be anything from hard topics like that to the big one, sexual experiences, the reason people are saying there's porn in schools. One, a lot of these books are just about LGBTQ themes and experiences that are being sexualized. So it's not a sexual experience, it's
Mm-hmm.
about identity. Two, a lot of these books deal with sexual assault or sexual violence, in which case this is also being sexualized, and really it's a story about violence,
Mm-hmm.
not sexual experience. And every time it's about empowering the people who have gone through that and being able to get on the other side. That's also a topic that doesn't wait for anyone, unfortunately. That is just a horrific part of it, but it's good that we have resources available to students who may need them. And two, like I said, like sexual experiences are an everyday part of a student's experience. And I'm talking about YA and adult novels. The other thing is there's this misconception that like these books are available in elementary schools. They are
Yeah.
not. They couldn't even read them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like an elementary school would pick it up and be like, "These words are big. I'm putting it down."
There
Like
are no
that.
pictures in here.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's just not realistic to think, even pedagogically, much less thematically. That's not in there. And also, this is not like a free for all where anybody can put a book on a school library. Like educators and librarians are trained to be able to do this, and believe me, they are not. They wouldn't want to deal with it. Two,
Mm-hmm.
they are choosing what's pedagogically appropriate for students because that is what they've dedicated their lives to. Like they are not doing this for the fame, the glory, the money. Like they are doing this because they so wholeheartedly believe in having these stories available to students. So the idea that we've now vilified like the picture of, you know what I mean? Like we have this picture of what a librarian is and looks like and
Mm-hmm.
acts. And so many times when I talk to people, they're like, oh, but my librarian, my teachers are great. I'm talking about those over there. Well, point to those over there because the people over there think their librarians and their teachers are great. And it's almost this distance that people have created in their minds is the reason they've been able to fabricate these stories because they think it's somehow different. But I want you to think about your own teacher, your own librarian. That's who's actually in the classrooms and in the school libraries.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I wonder if it's similar to the conversation about like um, international news versus local news, where our brains aren't capable of holding that much information. And it's easier to make something to be more of a boogeyman if it feels farther away. And it's going to come closer and closer. But like looking at where it is most important is to be involved in your local area, and probably this is the same message applies to these groups too. Like if you have an issue with something in your local environment, then do speak up and have that conversation rather than um, engage in a conversation that is happening elsewhere, I guess.
No, that's such a good point. And one of the things I say, one of the reasons I think this was able to happen is because it's almost like the systems that were in place, like why we didn't have book bans before, is if a parent had an issue with a book or had concerns, they would go directly to the librarian, the,
Mm-hmm.
the teacher. That's like, that's a relationship that's really, really key for us to maintain. But I feel like more and more we're seeing going directly to the school board, the superintendent. And it's like, that you're now involving people who actually don't understand the situation or the environment or even maybe your concern. So
Mm-hmm.
if parents are concerned, which there's a lot of reasons why parents should be can be concerned for their own children, that's an admirable part, and that's a welcome involvement. But go directly to the schools and work it out. Show support too. One of the things I say is, you don't want to, if you're going to be somebody who has concerns, like make sure you're also showing up for when things are going right.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure you're also coming in and helping, volunteering. If you are, privileged enough to have the time and opportunity for that, we all should be supporting our public education, not tearing it down. And unfortunately, what this is about, a pernicious aspect of it, is actually tearing down public education as we know it,
Mm-hmm.
but they're kind of putting it in this, clothing of parents' rights to be able to gain support from people who don't fully realize what's going on or why it's being promoted like it is. So if you're looking to be more involved, great, be more involved, but do it directly with your schools, and offer your own criticisms, but also your support when things are going well.
Yeah, definitely. Could you talk more about this attack on public education?
Yeah, I mean, for this is, like I mentioned, this has been a coordinated effort, right? And we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing public education at large being attacked from censorship angles, but from other, practical angles as well. And there's a host of reasons as to why that may be happening, but we have to already keep in mind how fragmented and vulnerable public education was, especially after the pandemic. And I think because of that vulnerability, we almost went from a pandemic time where everyone was like, teachers are the first responders, they are the best, they are the superheroes of our society, to suddenly like, they are the worst, they are villains, they are indoctrinating, which is just educating, indoctrinating our children, and I
Uh-huh.
think it partially why that was able to happen was because of a vulnerability that public schools had, because they have to do, a teacher, a librarian has to wear so many hats nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And now, on top of being, an educator, a pseudo parent at times, a first responder, I mean, the kind of safety drills that they have to do nowadays, they're also having to be free expression and First Amendment experts. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, that's not that's not why they signed up to be in a classroom and teach students how to be better, more informed people. That's actually what they signed up for. And we're really forcing, I worry a lot about all of these different hats that we're forcing upon them, us included, and asking them to be, defenders of the books. And that should just go with the territory. They shouldn't have to be, promoting that any extra. They should just, as educators, that should be understood. But unfortunately, due to the pressure that these groups are exerting on them, as well as the state legislation, a lot of times that is the decision they're having to make. And I worry a lot about the position that we're putting current teachers and educators in, but also, we know there's a teacher shortage. We know that there's recruitment issues. So I worry a lot about how this is going to impact public education 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting how the conversation has turned into teachers today indoctrinating our children because, yeah, it feels like a coordinated effort feels more like the signs of indoctrination than an individual going through an interview process, um, having a curriculum, like adhering to the state curriculum, adhering to like coming up with their own classroom curriculum, using their own money to purchase classroom supplies and all of that, and accusing them of indoctrinating children. It's really
No,
quite ironic.
it really is. And you're right, there's so much oversight. It's also this idea that like teachers have been able to go off the rails, and it's like there's so much oversight that's always
Uh huh.
existed for this, and curriculum that's set, and they have to work within their own teams and within the district and within the state, and so like there's always been all of this oversight conducted. And I also think it's really important to acknowledge that education is not about presenting one viewpoint or another. It is about developing critical thinking and be able to engage with materials. So sometimes even a lesson is not presented so that teachers, are saying, oh, please just agree with this topic. It's for students to learn how to critically engage, agree and disagree. This is why we have classroom discussions. This is why, like
Mm-hmm.
this is we need to have fact-based education. We need to have historically correct information, but at the same time, it is about them being able to engage with it. And certainly, the classrooms being targeted by the book ban crisis, English classrooms are like the number one type of classroom where you're supposed to be engaging with the material, agreeing, disagreeing, being able to verbalize that, and forming language for that. So the point is not, even if I'm like, even if this kind of like parents' rights group one. I'm like, well, that's not the point of education to present one viewpoint or not. Like, the
Mm-hmm.
entire point of it is to be able to allow our students to go into a world where they're going to come across differing viewpoints, differing from their own, differing in a way that they've never even explored before, and give them the tools to be able to deal with that effectively as informed citizens, instead of just, what are we teaching our students instead? That anything that's presented to them, they should just agree immediately and move on like that. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think anyone would agree that's a great way of being able to run an educational center.
Yeah. So, is there hope? Yeah,
um, that's just the question. Is there
that's
hope?
just the question.
Yes, there is a lot of hope, because it's really bad right now, and it's really bad for the free expression experts, but it's really bad across a lot of different civil rights that are being challenged. It's a lot, but I almost so many people are so angry, and sometimes people look at that as a bad thing, and I love it. I'm like, yes, this is the emotion that's going to carry us through, because being complacent is so much worse than being angry and being able to go and stand up to this. And there was an interesting survey that pretty much for every like one parent that's trying to like censor books, or community member that's trying to censor books, there's two who are trying to keep it, and it's so much harder to keep it, to keep the material. But that gave me so much hope that there's so many people out there. There's so many wonderful parent advocates, student advocates, teachers, and librarians, different, nonprofit organizations, going down to the district all the way up to the national level, who are fighting this. And I take a lot of hope from the authors who are still sharing their stories, who are still, sharing their words and their gifts with us. And they are the ones, for me, who are fostering so much hope and fighting for themselves, fighting for their own families, their own identities, and being able to keep doing this. Because at the end of the day, to me, we'll get out of this. The country will become what the country is, but you can't stop information. You maybe can reorient how people receive it, but we're just trying to take away as many barriers as possible to try to make it easier for people to receive, and have the right to receive information. But information will always be flowing. So that's kind of what I try to remind myself of, and that I'm really not alone. I'm not standing with the bullhorn alone, shouting First Amendment principles at people. Like, we are so surrounded, and then there's so many people who are also fighting, who I've never met, I've never talked to, but we're still fighting for these same principles, for these same stories. So for me, I find a lot of hope for that. I find a lot of hope of just hearing different stories in the news of different districts, that sometimes, the ones that have really bad outcomes are the ones that get heard the most. But there's some out there of people, using litigation, using legislation. There's freedom to read legislation that has been passed in a bunch of states that didn't
Mm-hmm.
exist before. And because we didn't know it needed to exist before, but now it does. So, there's still hope out there. And we just need to be able to keep it's unfortunately progress is inch by inch, right? So we just need to keep pushing like little by little, but being really celebratory of those every inch that we get, and just kind of being able to sigh, mourn, and then accept every mile that we lose is kind of the attitude that I've taken towards it.
Yeah, that's really quite beautiful. Kind of a new serenity prayer in
Yes,
the.
every night in the mirror to myself.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
I would love to hear. I know you don't have a book maybe for today, but what banned books? You mentioned that usually y'all read a banned book and talk about it. So
Yeah, we usually pick a book, and so we're working on season 4 right now. So I just finished The Court of Thorn and Roses last night, and we'll be talking about that, which is interesting because I read it previously before it actually got really popular. Not to be like a hipster, but I did not like it then. I gave it like 2 stars. I was like, I didn't. That was okay. But then reading it again this time around, I don't know if it's like I just need something light and fluffy. I'm like, man, solid romance.
solid romance. No, I think that is, and the romance genre being so targeted to me is very. interesting because,
Mm-hmm.
the literary kind of romance genre is so centered on women's pleasure that I'm kind of like, that's not by accident. That's what's getting attacked,
Yeah.
And that so many women authors or non-binary authors are the ones who are actually getting like banned for having, sexual encounters like scenes within their works versus like the ones by I have no data to back this up except just like a hunch as a researcher that it's less valued or seen as having less literary merit because
Mm.
it's written by non-binary and women authors. So that is very curious. I haven't read it yet. I need
Oh, you
to
haven't read it
on
yet?
my yeah. I think it's in the mail getting sent to me right now.
Oh,
So
yeah.
mhm.
That one is a funny example of book banning to me because one, I don't think it is in a lot of like school libraries, and yet like it is brought up a ton. If it is, it might be in YA, but even still, like it takes one read of it and be like, oh, we'll just like recategorize that.
Yeah, well, and it's so, the YA adult categories, they're in, predominantly book bans in general are in high schools. So
Mm-hmm.
it's always really funny to me to be like, some of those students are like 17, 18, 19. So
Yeah.
it's like, do we just not have books? It's like we're having to, um, a lot of what I've read about like past book banning attempts and censorship attempts of books is the idea that like we have to have an adult world that's like watered down for children and how
Mm.
and that has been used as an argument that like we can't do that, you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
um and that's how I feel about a school library where a student is going and choosing a book is that there's some kind of inherent interest there. There's some kind of so for me the discussion would be going to my student and being like or my child and being like, what about this book, and I think that's maybe the discussions that were happening before because why didn't we have this level of book banning 10 years ago?
Yeah.
It's not because some of these books weren't available. A lot of these books were available. They've been in curriculum for a long time. The Kite Runner is, a really banned book. I read that in high school,
Mm-hmm.
and it was shocking and disturbing in some aspects because that is the point of the book.
Yeah.
There's some scenes that if you read it and you think, oh, okay, I'm just going to move on with my day after this, like there's something wrong there. Like you need to unpack that. Like it's supposed to be shocking. It's supposed to be disturbing. It's supposed to be, moving. But and it was, but I remember talking to my mom about it and being
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, this is what happened. I don't want to give spoilers and stuff, but I'm like, this is what happened. This is how I'm feeling about it, and like having that discussion, and that to me is so much more important than being like, oh, we're just not going to have these materials. And at least that was assigned reading. This wasn't even a library book that I went and
Mm-hmm.
picked out. You know what I mean? And certainly there, were books like that, and I would just skip over the parts that made me uncomfortable. Like
Yeah.
I was allowed to do that. So I think those skill sets to me seem much more important than the idea that we're just not gonna, you know what I mean? Nobody can ever come across a court of thorn and risk. Somebody could also find that in a public library somewhere else, and it's just important to be having that dialogue and that discussion with your own child versus thinking that who. And inherently, this begs the question: who gets to decide then?
Mm-hmm.
Because what books some parents think is appropriate, some others don't, and vice versa. And some that people think are vital to the very existence of their community and family, other people are against. And the idea is that it's all open and that we should be having enough discussion amongst each other to be able to engage with these materials that in a way that is beneficial. But yeah, so for a court, I think about that all the time. That I'm like, I think I would have just come across it, skipped over parts I didn't like necessarily like, or asked questions of those around me, and then moved on. I'm not even sure for half of these books. I'm like, would it have been memorable? Probably not. Like,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, I a lot of these book bans and challenges really undermine like kids' ability to do that. Like the
mhm.
fact that, hey, like trust me, I know I've put down books. I'm like, well, whatever. It's because I didn't like it, because I didn't like, I found something objectionable or whatever. It was boring. All of the above. Like, kids might even like lose interest in a book before the objectionable parts. And so,
Yeah.
like, even having the book out there to let kids develop their own taste in books and art and all of that is really important to building up who they are, especially in a world. Well, I work with AI, and so in a world where like AI is mimicking humans, like the thing
Mm,
that will set us apart is that feeling and art and taste, because machines don't have taste, they just spit back what you think is tasteful. um,
that's such
and
a
I
good
think,
point.
yeah, and I think like from a young age you start developing taste, and you just need more and more in encounters to refine that.
No, that's such a good point too. That this is going to be this next generation of students is going to have the most exposure to AI computers. So the idea, like having a humanities education and having them being able to even parse through what is, human taste and what is computer, like it's so important that that's a skill set that they need, that we almost, I'm like, am I now in a generation where I'll never be able to develop it? I hope not. But like,
Yeah.
like like, will I be able to encounter it and being able to tell the difference? But it makes it even more important that these real human stories told by humans, talking about the human experience, like it's even more important that they're available to them to be able to distinguish from, other perhaps useful, but yeah, just regurgitating existing information.
Mm-hmm. A lot of book bans often remove award winning literature and classics alongside some contemporary works. So often the books that are being targeted are, like you said, have been in curriculum for decades. Um, what do you see these parents offering um, alternatives to these books of like, oh, like To Kill a Mockingbird addresses these issues. I don't like it because of this. So can we do this book because it addresses the same thing, but in a way that I like is more palpable.
um I have not to my knowledge, probably because the experts already selected those books, the
Mm-hmm.
librarians and the teachers. So like the people who would have the knowledge to do that have already selected those books. And you're absolutely right that it's one of the things I say about, the over 4,000 books we had just last year, unique titles that were banned, is that the only thing they have in common is that they're all banned in some capacity.
Mm.
The topics, the stories, the voices all range a lot, and anybody there would find something they love and something they hate. But so I haven't seen kind of like a reverse, and I would even still be worried though if one person was like, "Here's another option for this," because it's like you said, palatable to who, to whom's,
Yeah.
like who. It really begs the question of like who gets to decide. And the way that we manage to keep things neutral is by having the availability of a bunch of different materials. But one of the, in pointing out that some of these books are classics, some of these books have been, and those are the ones who usually get a lot of attention and stuff because they're so well known. So
Mm-hmm.
many people have read them if they're considered to be a classic novel, if they've been around for a long time, versus contemporary books are really important. And we're also just beginning to really diversify our library shelves to actually accurately depict our communities and the students who are reading those books. So certainly there's a really pernicious aspect of this movement that is banning, books by BIPOC authors and characters, LGBTQ plus community characters, authors, themes. It's a targeted attack. I see it on the challenge forums when people say why they want to ban a book. They're very transparent about their, racism, homophobia, transphobia, whatever it
Mm.
is. So that is a really present part, but I think it's also important for us to recognize the fact that this wasn't happening 10 years ago because it's a manufactured moral movement.
Mm,
um,
mm-hmm.
because it's not because these same people maybe had objections to this material back then, but it's because they this is being used as a tool to help dismantle public education, right? So
Yeah.
this was largely came from groups that were anti-mask at first, and then once those mandates were lifted, they were like, what do we pivot to next? Oh, book bans, okay. And no, but in some ways, like, it really did
Yeah.
happen like that, and gained a lot of traction, unfortunately. So um, that's the reason why this is suddenly like it is, because it is kind of a manufactured issue versus being able to resolve the actual issues going on, and the actual help that public education needs.
What are steps we can take, the listeners here?
Yeah, it's my favorite part, is moving on to what can we do about it. Vocal and local and vocal is what I always say, is going, it's a huge national problem. It absolutely is. But you have the most sway in your own local schools, local libraries, local community. But we have to be vocal about it. Like, it's not enough. Nobody knows what side you stand on if you just think to yourself, oh, I stand for the books. That we gotta be, and we're all book people, so the thought of being vocal is maybe not our milieu, like that is
Yeah.
not our thing. But we have to be a little more vocal. And I always say people have to develop their own brand of advocacy. There's people who want to go before a school board and speak about the importance of books and the importance of availability of them to different communities. Some people would rather eat glass than have to ever talk in front of another human. So don't do that if you're if you're that second type of person. But you may be the person who can write a really strongly worded letter. You may be the person who brings a plate of cookies to your public library, and talks to librarians about what issues they're facing and gives compliments on the pride display there. The importance of documenting and being vocal about the positive things is also really necessary, because if there's somebody who gets 5 complaints about something like a pride display, but they have 10 other people who have documented their appreciation for it, that goes a long way for being able to show where the community stands. And it may be that 20 people passed by that display in one day and thought, yay, okay, I'm so glad that's there, and then moved on with their days, not realizing maybe they had to, they should say something about it. And one person complained and documented it, and now that library is thinking about taking down the pride display.
Hmm.
So it's important that we're also vocal in our appreciation of the things that are going right, and that, we don't, sometimes there's cases where maybe 8 books are being removed, 5 are kept, and 3 are removed from libraries. It's okay to also be like appreciative of the 5, and then be like, but those 3 need to come back, and here's my
Yeah.
reasons why. And don't be afraid to be the squeaky wheel who calls,
Mm-hmm.
this is how books get banned, right? So let's use their system against them, and also be the squeaky wheel on the other side that calls every day and says, hey, it's perks of being a wildflower back on shelves. No, all
Yeah.
right, talk to you tomorrow. Like,
Yeah.
it can be simple actions that have a huge effect, but doing that on a local level, and it's happening everywhere. Some people think, well, my community may not be facing this. It is. It's happening everywhere. This has become a national movement. It affects something like 42, 43 states. I'd have to look at my own research at this point. So, and that's just what we have documented. So it's actually much bigger than what we can even have written down. So getting local and getting vocal and talking to your neighbors, talking to those around you, making sure people understand what this movement is actually about, that it's not about these, porn in schools, these books, obscene materials. It's like, well, think critically about it. Why wasn't this book banned 10 years ago then? Why was it first selected? But librarians go to school for this, like they are
Mm-hmm.
not looking for this kind of trouble. Like, they
Yeah.
just want, even if somebody doesn't agree with having, doesn't agree with, I'm not even going to pretend I'm queer myself. I was going to say like an LGBTQ lifestyle, but it's still important that those materials be available. Like, then just talk to your own students about, like, but reason with the people around you. And unfortunately, it does require us having those kind of harder conversations, but we got into this mess because we refused to have them. So,
Mm-hmm.
and the other side is having them. They're duking it out on what they believe and what they're going to push forward and not. So we got to be doing that ourselves and be presenting a little bit more of a unified, positive force for these books.
Yeah, definitely. I'm all about local and vocal. Thank you. Thank you, Sabrina, for your time. And if people needed resources from PEN America, where would we find those?
Yeah, pen.org is our
PEN.
website, and you'll see a bunch of different issue areas because I'm here talking about book bans and censorship in public education, but we Penn had such a wonderful, wonderful staff who was working on a bunch of different censorship issues having to do with authors, journalists, and higher ed, mis and disinformation, digital safety. Like, there's so much that we do. So, if you go on pen.org and you look at there's a little tab for issue areas. You can click in on book bans, and you can click in and get involved with a bunch of different topics, and we have different tip sheets and information centers there where you can find our research and different advocacy steps that we recommend.
Awesome. And before we close, one last question for you. What is one banned or challenged book that you would recommend to listeners?
I thank you for not saying favorite, because usually I'm like, I don't make me pick amongst my children. So I'm gonna cheat, and I'm gonna give three, and I'm gonna do them across different levels. So first is
Yeah.
a picture book called "And Tango Makes Three." Love that. And it's also Pride Month, so all of mine are going to be queer.
Yeah.
But "And Tango Makes Three," love it. It's my favorite complaint of a banned book because people have claimed that it's like unnatural, and it's based on a true story about two penguins who adopt a little egg together. So the illustrations are gorgeous. It's a highly contested book for no good reason, and I think that it's really cute. Another more like middle grade level is Drama. Um, and it's I don't know if it would be considered a graphic novel or a comic, but it is really cute. And it, to me, I don't know, it encapsulates what that grade level like is experiencing, kind of the little anxieties and stuff you have at that age. So I think that's really, really cute. And then in the adult genre, Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, I think is beautifully, beautifully done. And I always say it's one that I read and it's known for being a graphic novel, for having an illustrative element to it, but the text is so gripping. Like, and that was really what took me by surprise, and I thought was really wonderful about that one. So those are my three, off the top of my head, those are my three picks.
That's awesome. And Fun Home's actually on our upcoming season, so I'm
Yay!
excited for
All
that.
right, so people need to get it and then join in the discussion.
Yeah, join in on the fun home. Well, thank you again, Sabrina, and we're very grateful that you were able to come and talk to us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for inviting me and letting me talk about my work.
All right, we'll catch you another time.
Sounds great.
Burn This Book is produced by us, Nicola Corin and Eden Wen.
Music by myself, Nicole, and performed by my dad, Frank.